Okay, David, go ahead.
Okay.
Ambassador David Lee will introduce you briefly.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. I'll provide just a very brief introduction for Ambassador Bolton, who no doubt needs none to this panel. Ambassador John Bolton served an illustrious career at the State Department, the Justice Department, the Agency for International Development, and as National Security Advisor at the White House. He graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree, summa cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa from Yale College in 1970, and received his juris degree from Yale Law School in 1974. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ambassador Bolton.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be with you again, and excellent timing with a lot to talk about. So, I will talk for a few minutes here and get things going. I know this is a group that's not shy, and you'll have a lot of questions and observations, and I really look forward to that. I have to say, it's we're in a world now that I don't think anybody would have predicted 12 months ago. Who would have thought that North Korean forces are fighting inside Russia against Ukrainian forces in a new configuration that I don't think was predictable or imaginable, and who knows what that means for what the Russians are paying for these mercenaries to engage with them, and whether it's nuclear technology or ballistic missile technology or air defense technology or just plain money. Think of the combat experience that North Korean forces are getting in Europe, and what that may mean for the future. But I think I just want to step back for a second, because I think there is a big picture here of which this North Korean Russian engagement is a significant part. But the bigger picture that a couple of years ago was perhaps controversial, but I think is close to conventional wisdom now, is we've got a new China-Russia axis in formation. It's not complete. It's got its tensions and its problems. It has a long way to go, but it is something that is reminiscent of the Sino-Soviet alliance of Cold War days, with one huge difference, and this time obviously China's the dominant partner and Russia's the subordinate partner. It's got its outriders, as in Cold War days, North Korea, Syria, Iran, Belarus, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, maybe more in stock. We don't know exactly how it's going to develop, but China's assistance to Russia in the war in Ukraine in various ways, laundering Russian money through the opaque Chinese financial system, increased purchases of Russian oil and gas, all kinds of other assistance up to and including weapons assistance, all of which China will expect from Russia in return if it threatens Taiwan or makes other advances in the East China Sea or the South China Sea, or towards South Korea or anybody in the first island chain. This is something that is a new dynamic that the incoming Trump administration is obviously going to have to face up to. I don't think the Biden administration really took it seriously, but it's real and it's coming. And I think the dangers to our friends along China's Indo-Pacific periphery and interest of the United States really all around the Horn, from Japan and South Korea all the way around to Finland and Sweden, are now affected by this development. The efforts that China has made in a number of respects, I think, based on a couple of recent trips I've been on to South Korea within the past year, it's impressed me that in South Korea there's a greater, perhaps because of President Yoon, perhaps for other reasons, a greater appreciation that South Korea is for well or ill part of the bigger picture when it comes to China. It's not just the threat on the peninsula from North Korea, although that's obviously real and getting worse in a number of respects, but China's assertiveness along its periphery, notwithstanding the extensive commercial ties between South Korea and China, really puts South Korea on a par with Japan, Taiwan, others as you go down the island chain into Southeast Asia. And I see a perspective in South Korea that really appreciates that and reflects that security for South Korea is increasingly tied to this bigger picture and how to deal, again, not just with North Korea, but with China too. So it's no surprise that we've seen President Yoon's government over the past couple of years selling artillery and ammunition to Poland, engaged now with the government of Ukraine to see how they can cooperate in dealing with North Korea. The really, I think, very courageous decision by President Yoon to agree to trilateral military maneuvers among Japan, the U.S., and South Korea, something certainly his predecessor never would have done. And from the U.S. perspective, I think that's incredibly important. We're all more secure if the bilateral alliances of the U.S. and its partners can be expanded and new structures can be created. I've said before, I think that the progress in the Asian Security Quad, Japan, India, Australia, and the U.S. under Biden has been pretty significant. I personally think South Korea ought to join that and make it a quint. I think it's entirely appropriate if South Korea wanted to do that. I think the AUKUS deal to provide nuclear-powered submarines, to build submarines, U.S., U.K., and Australia is a great idea. I think there's a role for South Korea in comparable organizations. You know, I don't think there's any one overall arching right formula for security developments in the Asia-Pacific and the Indo-Pacific perimeter. I think we need to be doing a lot and experimenting. I'm not saying NATO and Asia is going to happen overnight. We've been through that discussion over decades. But increased cooperation among different countries at different levels, at different speeds, I think it's all worth experimenting about. Because I do think that we face a common threat and that bringing others into this cooperation is going to make for beneficial relationships for all of us. South Korea's got some incredibly complex discussions going on now in a wide range of areas. And as I mentioned, the military maneuvers with Japan and the U.S., but specifically on the question of nuclear weapons, whether there's sufficient faith in the U.S. nuclear umbrella, whether our capacity for extended deterrence still has credibility in South Korea and Japan. There's an open debate about an independent nuclear capability in both Japan and South Korea. Personally, and I'm sure this will produce reaction, I don't think independent nuclear capabilities in either country are really in their best interest or in ours. I think if there's concern about the reliability of the United States as an ally, which I can certainly understand, given recent developments, I think we ought to talk about that before we automatically conclude that spreading the number of nuclear weapon states is the right way to answer it. I do think that the negotiations between the ROK and the U.S. over a better demonstration of that capability, the nuclear talks that have been concluded in the past couple months, is a good step. I would also be willing to say that the U.S. should be prepared to redeploy tactical nuclear weapons on the peninsula to demonstrate the deterrent more palpably. Might make sense. But look, these are discussions that we have to have, and we're allies, and we ought to talk about it openly with the ROK government and with the government of Japan. The North Koreans are very close to a deliverable nuclear weapons capability. They probably got most of what they need, certainly from the U.S. perspective. We don't know if they've got reentry vehicles on ICBMs that can survive reentry and hit us. We don't know what their guidance systems are. But given the proximity, obviously, geographically to South Korea and Japan, those states are open to attack right now. And Kim Jong-un, I have to say, and I'll conclude with this because I really want to hear reactions, has turned out to be much more successful in pursuing what he sees as North Korea's interests than most of us, I'll include myself in that group, most of us predicted. This cooperation with Russia in the Ukraine war, I think, puts Kim Jong-un really squarely in the shoes of his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, who was a master at playing off Stalin and Mao Zedong, up to and including the negotiations before the North invaded the South in June of 1950. Kim has maneuvered North Korea into a position really between the Chinese and the Russians, and that's going to make him stronger in any negotiations with South Korea, with the United States on nuclear weapons. He's more dangerous now than he was 4 years ago, and he's getting more dangerous still as those North Korean troops gain combat experience. So I think we're in a dangerous world. I think this is the last moment in time when the United States should move in an isolationist direction. I think both in political and military issues, it's a mistake. I think we should be strengthening our alliances, not weakening them, not calling them into question. And I don't think it's time for a trade war, although it looks to me like we're headed in that direction. We may not know the exact shape of it, but I think that's coming in the near term, and that won't be a good thing for any of us. So we're in a very dangerous environment globally because of the China-Russia axis. We're facing a range of threats across really the full spectrum of military and political warfare, with hybrid and gray zone warfare playing a larger and larger role. And I do think that many people question whether the U.S. has the staying power to do what's necessary. I hope it does, but it's a subject I'm sure many people will want to talk about. So this is a great time to have an exchange of ideas, and very important. And maybe with luck, some of this will filter through to the new administration in Washington, and when it comes in January, and will contribute to the overall security of East Asia and South Asia and the Pacific as a whole. So thanks again for the invitation. I really appreciate the chance to be with you, and fire away.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Before we get into the Q&A, let me make a small comment. ICAS is not an agent of any government or foreign principal. There's no foreign fund involved in ICAS activities. Thank you. Danny Alum, are you out there?
I am, yes.
Go ahead, Dan.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Ambassador Bolton, you identified that there are many mutual interests between South Korea and the U.S. If I could just take a step back and ask you, what, in your view, are the core U.S. national interests, and how would you prioritize them? I know in your book and in other places you don't like academic exercises, but I imagine they in some ways inform your decision-making and advising. So I'd be curious to know, what do you consider top national interests?
Well, I take a pretty traditional view of what national interests are. It's protection of the people and the territory of the United States and its friends and allies, the fostering of international commerce and travel and communications. I don't think everything is a national security interest. I don't think the environment is a national security interest. It's an interest, but it's not a national security interest. I think if everything is a national security interest, then ultimately nothing is, and it clouds your analytical capability. But I think those interests are global, and I think since 1945, whatever minimal order there's been in the world has not been because of the United Nations or anybody else. It's been the combination of the U.S. and its allies and the power we've deployed that's allowed the globalization of the economy and helped kept us secure. And if you just say, well, the United States is going to walk away from that, I think inevitably when we leave and a vacuum is created, somebody steps into it, and it's not somebody who's going to be particularly sympathetic to our interests or those of our friends and allies. So I reject the idea that some have. I reject the general isolationist impulse, but I also in particular reject the idea that we don't really have interest in Europe that we have to worry about. The Middle East is kind of a pain in the neck. We don't need to worry about that. We just should worry about East Asia and particularly Taiwan. You know, if that were all we had to worry about, then why are the Chinese, Russians, and Iranians conducting joint naval maneuvers in the Arabian Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean? I mean, I could go on, but I think, as I said, what minimal order and stability there is in the world, it's the structure of American alliances that's provided it, and I don't know any substitute that's out there, frankly.
Thank
you so
you.
much.
Bruce Bennett.
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Can you hear
Yes,
me?
I can hear you.
Sure, go ahead.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the Hanoi summit? Why was it, do you think, that President Trump walked out?
Because we weren't going to reach an agreement. That was clear before lunch. We all expected we'd have another lunch with Kim Jong-un, but Trump decided we had reached an impasse. And look, I think the North Koreans believed that that Trump would do the same sort of thing the U.S. had done in at least two prior administrations, Clinton with the agreed framework and George W. Bush with the negotiations that were conducted there. Not much happened under Obama, but basically it would be a trade of a commitment to give up North Korea's nuclear weapons program in exchange for some economic benefits, the relief of sanctions and perhaps other things. And I think that model is fundamentally flawed. I think the North Koreans are very good at making commitments to give up their nuclear weapons program. I've counted at least 5 clear instances where they pledged to do that. They just never seem to get around to it. And the way the prior agreements are structured is that the economic benefits to North Korea are up front and the hard work of denuclearization is at the back end, and that's why you never get to it. But we talked about a lot of things at the in Singapore and then in Hanoi, and in particular, you know, just basic arms control precepts about an open declaration of what North Korea's nuclear facilities look like, because we had a pretty good idea of what they look like. And in arms control negotiations, it's that declaration that tells each side how honest and forthcoming the other side is being. So I wanted to see what they said they had and compare it to what we knew they had. And they didn't even want to start down that road. I think Kim Jong-un was very surprised. In North Korea, we've heard that some of the people who were in that room with us are no longer among the living. I don't know whether that's true or not, but he was a pretty unhappy guy at the end of that meeting, and he didn't take up Trump's offer to fly him on Air Force One back to Pyongyang. He just went back on his own.
Yeah. Very good. William King, go ahead. William King.
Yes, sir. Can you hear me now?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. Hey, sir, it's interesting how South Korea is watching our administrations over the last several and reacting to it. Notice recently they've stood up a STRATCOM. What are your thoughts on where they want to go, given that they have talked about a preemptive strike capability, not necessarily relying solely on the nuclear deterrence umbrella?
Well, I think Kim Jong-un really believes that it's a realistic goal to reunify the Korean Peninsula under his regime. I think he believes that. If he doesn't believe it, he's putting on a pretty good show. I think this is part of a long-running performance art on his part. I don't think it's particularly aimed at the Trump administration. I think it's been in the works for a long time, but I think it is intended to show both the U.S. and the ROK government and anybody else who's paying attention that they're very serious and don't plan to be conciliatory particularly. But how much of it will be performance art once Trump gets in office? And whether, the president who said that he and Kim had fallen in love will come back again, and maybe there are other possibilities. But I do think the risks are rising on the peninsula, and I think it's one reason we have a more extensive discussion now, for well or ill, about an independent South Korean nuclear capability. So I think this has got to be a priority for the new administration. Whether it is or not, is anybody's guess.
Very good. Don Kurt, go ahead.
Mr. Ambassador, you mentioned that the trade war at the end of your remarks, the implications. President Trump has just said that he's going to slap a 10% tariff on China and 30% on Canada and Mexico. And he's also talking about a 60% tariff eventually on Chinese goods, 10% on the rest, including Korea, no doubt. So what are the implications of all this, and where is this going to go, and what will this do to our alliances with Korea and Japan and the whole standoff with China on the periphery of Asia?
Yeah, well, it won't be good. I mean, these numbers with Trump, numbers kind of come and go with Trump. 10%, 20%, 60%, 25%. I mean, that's today. Let's see what he says tomorrow. I think he's throwing a lot of dust in the air. He's throwing out firecrackers and seeing who jumps on him. But I don't think for all his, as people like to say, he's a real estate developer, and that's the way they negotiate. And but beneath all that is a very strong determination to use tariffs, not just against America's adversaries, but against our friends. I mean, the proposals to have a 20% across-the-board tariff on all imports into the United States is going to have more of an effect on our friends than it will on our adversaries, a negative effect. Trump basically doesn't understand tariffs, although I can assure you it's been explained to him. I've been in the room when very competent economists and financiers have explained it. He thinks that the foreign sellers of goods and foreign governments are paying the tax. He doesn't understand that the mechanism is that the American importer pays the tariff to get the goods out of the customs zone when they land at some American port, and that obviously they then try and pass the cost on to the consumer in the form of higher prices. He thinks we're taxing foreigners. And as I say, it's been explained to him, and he doesn't take it on board. I don't know how else to put it. I think that he's being driven in the short term, and this is more immediate than I frankly realized until I looked into it about a week ago, because he wants to extend the 2017 tax cuts, which they're going to attempt to do through the congressional budget reconciliation process, which needs to take place in March. They're saying to the tax writing and budget committees in Congress that they're going to plug the revenue loss that extending the tax cuts represents to the scorers at the Congressional Budget Office, but they're going to offset it in substantial part with the revenue from tariffs. Now, to put that into a reconciliation package, even though the tariffs may not take effect until the end of the year when the tax cuts were scheduled to terminate, or earlier, I don't know that, but you're going to have to announce who's being tariffed, what's being tariffed, and what the tariff rate is for CBO to score all this. So in effect, within 6 to 10 weeks after the new administration comes in, they've got to put whatever their tariff package is going to be out there. That doesn't provide time to negotiate with anybody, any foreign country beforehand to change that. So I think what Trump seems to be doing is he's going to announce the tariffs. I think that will trigger retaliation by the European Union, Japan, China for sure, others, including South Korea and Taiwan, before the negotiation takes place. And then you may have, if the tariffs don't take effect till the end of the year, you've got 9 months, 8 months to do the negotiation. I think it's potential for economic chaos as people say, well, what tariffs do we face? What's the rate going to be? Are there going to be other retaliations? Are there going to be new tariffs? I'm very worried. I'll leave it to the economists to calculate how bad it's going to be, but I don't see anything good coming out of it. And if during this turmoil, China, for example, decides to cause trouble in the East China Sea, if it extends the intrusions, for example, into Japanese or ROK airspace and maritime domains that they've already done beyond the Senkaku Islands. They've already done it for the mainland of Japan. If they do this in South Korea, if the North Koreans pose a problem, while we're trying to negotiate our way through the tariff war, these security threats in East Asia could be provocations that China or North Korea might undertake against a new, I mean, it's old in one sense, but it's a new Trump administration with a lot of new people in it, just to test them to see how they do, just like they tested George W. Bush with the EP3 incident in early 2001. So I think it's a potentially very dangerous time over the next 3 to 6 months.
Thank you, John. Joe Bosco, go ahead.
Hi, John. It's great to see you again.
Nice to see you.
You know better than anyone, and you just indicated that many of these international crises, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, the Indo-Pacific, are interrelated. They certainly reflect on U.S. credibility to handle the various issues. So I'd like to ask you about Taiwan, if I may. Your most famous predecessor never set foot on the island. I know you've been there many times. My question would be, is it time now to get rid of the policy of strategic ambiguity and declare once and for all that the U.S. will defend Taiwan? I know Joe Biden has said it 3 or 4 times, but each time his administration has walked back his comments saying there's no change in policy. What is the official policy of the U.S.? Is it still strategic ambiguity, or are we committed to defend Taiwan?
You know, I think the answer to that question is probably both, which leads to the next question of what does that mean? And I'm not sure the Biden administration knows. I would say on strategic ambiguity, it made sense at the time it was promulgated, but there aren't a lot of Henry Kissingers around today who can do what he could do with that kind of ambiguity. So I felt for some time that we need to be straighter about it, that the chances of avoiding a conflict across the Taiwan Strait are better if we're clear about it than if we preserve the ambiguity. I mean, I said 20 years ago we should go to full diplomatic relations with Taiwan. If you read the Shanghai communique clearly, I think that we're past the point where you can say that all Chinese on both sides of the strait hold the same view, because on Taiwan there aren't many who think they're Chinese anymore. They think they've become Taiwanese, just like Americans felt they'd become Americans and weren't English anymore in 1776. But the point is to preserve peace and security along China's periphery. Taiwan is the biggest target. We know that. We know that from what the Chinese themselves say. And I think that its role in the first island chain means it's impossible for us not to come to its defense and have any credibility left anywhere in East Asia. The best way to avoid military conflict is strong deterrence, and we've got a long way to go to reestablish our own credibility on that point. I don't think that's what Trump's going to do. I've told the story before, but it's worth, I think, repeating. I saw him in the Oval Office many times sitting behind the Resolute desk, take one of his Sharpie pens up and point to the tip and say, that's Taiwan, and then point to the desk and say, that's China. I mean, that tells a lot about what he thinks the priorities are. And during the campaign, he accused Taiwan of stealing the semiconductor manufacturing industry, which is completely untrue. It developed because Morris Chang left Texas Instruments when he didn't become CEO and set up Taiwan Semiconductor, and the rest, as they say, is history. So it's another area where Trump just doesn't understand what the background is and what needs to be done. I don't think Taiwan is at risk of a Chinese invasion. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think the Chinese have the confidence that they can conduct an amphibious operation across almost 100 miles of open sea. But I do think the threat is a pretext that China creates and throws a blockade around Taiwan. And then the question is, what do we and Japan and others do? And I don't think we've got a good answer to that at this point, although that's something we can discuss further. So this is why I think that in the ROK in particular, understanding that a Chinese threat to Taiwan is a threat to South Korea too is important to spread. In Japan today, if you ask the question, is a Chinese attack on Taiwan an attack on Japan? I think you'd get 2/3 or 75% who would say yes. I think in South Korea, I don't know what the number is, but I think the number of people who would say it is a threat to South Korea is growing. And I think that's the right answer. I think we've got to work on this together.
Thank you, John. Tong Kim, are you out there? Tong Kim,
Yeah,
go ahead.
thank you, Ambassador, for doing this for us. Now, I want one clarification on the matter of history, that you just said that it was Trump himself who rejected the North Korean proposal for closing Yongbyon nuclear facilities and in return for sanction easings. And but there are a lot of people who believe it was actually you and Pompeo who persuaded Trump at the scene, so he changed his mind at the last minute, which is true. Now, another question is...
Can I answer that one first before we go to the next one? Look, at the table, it was Trump who said basically, ultimately, no. I mean, my views on the North Korean nuclear program are pretty well known, I think. But as I always like to say, I was the national security advisor, not the national security decision maker. It was up to Trump to make up his mind, and he was the one who rejected the offer. So I'm glad to bask in that glory, but it was his decision, that's for sure.
But can you say he bought your idea, yours and Pompeo together?
Well, ultimately, but you know, it was a near-run thing. After Kim Jong-un left that meeting, Trump at one point said, why do we care about North Korea's nuclear program anyway? And I said, because they're developing nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles that can kill Americans. And he said, oh yeah, that's right. So, I mean, he does understand it, and he did make the decision.
Another question is, you just mentioned changing nature of deterrent, extended deterrent. And the question is, North Koreans are far more advanced than a few years ago, or even today, improving its nuclear capability every day. And can people still rely on the extended deterrent without doing anything different?
Well, I hope so, but I understand with what I would characterize as the reluctance of both the Obama and Biden administrations to really take the North Korean nuclear threat as seriously as they should. And given the erratic nature of Trump's decision making in the first term, and I think quite likely in the second term, people can say, well, people can legitimately ask, can we count on the Americans? And I think the answer to that question should be yes, but I don't think it's as obvious as it was perhaps 20 years ago. And I think this threat from North Korea is growing more palpable by the day. So if people don't count on the reliability of extended deterrence, it's also understandable why they're saying we need our own independent nuclear capability. The reason I'm worried about whether the ROK or Japan get that capability doesn't have anything to do with my lack of confidence in the soundness of decision making in Seoul and Tokyo. It's just the inevitable consequence of proliferation. Every time a new nation gets a nuclear capability, whether they're good guys or bad guys, several other countries say, you know, we need nuclear capability too. So the system is already fragile and on the verge of being breached again by the Iranians and perhaps others. And it may be that what was feared in the 1960s, you know, we're on the verge of seeing today. I hope not, but I'm just old-fashioned enough that I don't want to open the gates again. Not because I'm worried about South Korea or Japan. I'm worried about the other people who are going to react by saying, "Okay, we'll go that way too."
Thank you. Is sick hacker out there? Sick? You not jump in? It's not.
Okay, yes, I am here. Can you hear me?
Oh, sick. Go ahead.
Okay. Ambassador Bolton, it's very nice to see you. And I must say that I'm incredibly surprised as to how your views of the current situation I very much share. I've had
There's a record for you.
I've had great differences with you over the years, in terms of North Korea, where we went, why we did what we did. But what you laid out earlier today, I thought was just such a sensible approach, taking the situation that we have today, sort of never mind how we got here, but the situation that we have today. And I thought you did a great job of doing that. And I very much was very pleased to have you. It wouldn't make sense, for South Korea, Japan to get nuclear weapons. I very much agree with your sentiments there. The question that I would have, I've been thinking for quite some time when we sort of sensed the fact that Kim Jong-un was changing his approach to said, forget the American and hook up with the Russians and at least trying with the Japanese. And so things were clearly changing. And so I'd often thought about, maybe would this be a time that since Kim Jong-un has said, look, he's given up on the South. And as you had indicated, he's still looking, perhaps to make sure to put the whole Korean Peninsula, under his reign. Although what he said is, look, we're sovereign states, we're not going to link with each other anymore. Would this be a time for South Korea to actually consider, look, if you say we should be sovereign states, let's take you up on that. And have the South Koreans also forget the idea that perhaps, peaceful unification would be in their interest. So in other words, sort of a two Koreas situation. So have you thought about that? What do you think about that sort of possibility? Would it make sense to try to go there? And if so, how?
Well, I think obviously that's something that the South Korean government would have to decide on its own. I'm not a fan of that approach because I do think that the division of the Korean Peninsula remains an unnatural act. It was not thought that it would take this long in 1945. Obviously, it was designed to be temporary. The Korean War happened and froze it, but ultimately, as with the reunification of Germany, I know people don't like to compare the two, but the fact is that the reunification of Germany took place as part of a larger change that did bring peace and security to Europe. And as in times before, when Germany was 100 little princely states and it was the target of everybody's political aspirations, that caused instability in Europe. Finally, the reunification of Germany as a peaceful part of NATO was a major factor in getting stability in Europe. And it can't be that a permanently divided Korea is going to contribute to stability in Northeast Asia. Now, I don't have any hot ideas about how to get a reunification discussion going, and I think that really the change from President Moon's administration to President Yoon is important to remind a lot of people in South Korea that North Korea is a threat. I think a lot of people had forgotten that, but ultimately, and I don't see how to do it in the near term because I think Kim Jong-un has reinforced the stability of his regime by his ties to Russia, what we just discussed before. I don't think a long-term answer is a permanent division of the peninsula, but But as I say, given present circumstances, I don't see a negotiated way to make any progress there. I just don't see that happening unless Kim Jong-un has carried on one of the biggest con jobs going, and that he's lulling us into a state of disbelief. I don't see that. I think he really believes that a more powerful North Korea will lead to reunification under his terms, and I don't see that either, frankly.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Larry Nix, go ahead.
Yes. Hi, Sangjo. Can you hear me?
Okay, very good.
Ambassador Bolton, at the last ICAS session, General Scaparrotti confirmed that U.S. intelligence agrees with the South Korean National Intelligence Service estimate that in the last 2 years, North Korea has supplied Russia with 8 million artillery shells. And General Scaparrotti also added that represents 50% of the artillery shells that the Russians have fired at Ukrainian forces during that same period. 2 days ago, your successor, Mike Waltz, as National Security Advisor under President Trump, reminded us that despite all of this talk about long-range missiles, that the war in eastern Ukraine, as he put it, is very reminiscent of World War I. Extensive trenches and heavy artillery duels. And we know that the Ukrainians are definitely inferior in supplies of artillery shells compared to the Russians. And we know now that the North Koreans are in large part responsible for the Russian superiority. South Korea has supplied several $billion worth of military equipment to Poland in the last 2 years. South Korea has a huge production capability to produce artillery shells for the American-made howitzers that we have supplied to Ukraine. Would you recommend that South Korea begin a massive supply effort to directly supply Ukraine with artillery shells? And would you also recommend that, if necessary, either President Biden or President-elect Trump approach President Yoon and directly ask him to begin such an artillery supply program directly to Ukraine from South Korea? There are benefits if South Korea did this to the US-ROK alliance, which I can't go into in detail, but I can see 2 or 3 major benefits to the alliance if South Korea went ahead now with this.
Well, I'd be completely in favor of it. I mean, I would be in favor if South Korea decided that they wanted some of their troops to get combat experience in Ukraine too. I'm not saying that the U.S. ought to push them to do that, but it wouldn't bother me in the slightest. Frankly, what the problem is in Ukraine today is the result of the utterly non-strategic way in which the U.S. and NATO have provided military assistance to Ukraine. And you have long arguments about, do we give them ATACMS missiles, and so we debate it and then finally say yes. Do we give them Abrams tanks? Long debate, then we do it. Do we give them F-16s? Long debate, and then we do it. Do we extend the rules of the range that will allow the ATACMS to be fired? Long debate, and then we do it. You know, honestly, I think this derives from the mistaken intelligence at the beginning of the war, which was briefed to Congress after the Russians invaded, that Kyiv would fall in a matter of days and the whole country would fall in a matter of weeks. It's why we didn't provide more aid to Ukraine before the war began, because people said they're going to lose. The Russians are just going to get it all. But it's our declared position, not everybody agrees with it, but our declared position is that Ukraine should get full restoration of sovereignty and territorial integrity. But we have never done a strategic analysis that says, okay, well, if that's the objective, what do they need and how should we give it to them and how should we provide it in a timely fashion? And by dribbling it out for almost 3 years now, we've allowed the current gridlock on the battlefield in Ukraine to exist, because I think the administration's, while it certainly says we don't want Ukraine to lose, their greater fear is that Ukraine might win and provoke the wider war in the process that we've been so afraid of. I think Putin has been bluffing, but now, honestly, with the Trump administration coming in, I'm not sure that there'd be any support to provide extensive assistance from South Korea to the Ukrainians. I'm afraid that we're going to have a negotiation and the war is going to end and Russia's going to be validated in the 20% of Ukraine that it now possesses, and a new border will come from. This is what J.D. Vance suggested on the campaign trail along the front lines in Ukraine, and Ukraine commits not to join NATO, and that's the end of it. I mean, I think that's a terrible mistake, but I think that's the direction we're going in. And, if people who are more likely to be persuasive with the Trump administration than I am can change their mind on that, I'm all in favor of it, but I have to say I'm very worried.
Thank you. Elsie, Shin, go ahead.
Thank you for sharing your opinion, Mr. Ambassador. So I wanted to point out a serious and ongoing concern from Korea recently regarding the military conflict. So given the Trump recent election victory, the U.S. is demanding a huge amount of defense burden sharing from South Korea. So how do you assess the potential impact on this alliance, and what specific steps should the U.S. and ROK take to strengthen their partnership and address these new threats from North Korea?
Well, I think if Trump follows the pattern of his first term, both with respect to bilateral alliances and collective defense alliances like NATO, that we're in for some rough time. I would say, as a general proposition, I think Trump is so totally transactional and ad hoc and episodic that he doesn't accept the argument for what collective defense provides. And I will oversimplify here, but just a little bit. He thinks, let me just take NATO to get it out of the context of Korea. He thinks basically we're defending the Europeans, that we don't get anything out of it, and they don't pay us enough to do it. So why do we have NATO? In the case of South Korea, in the case of Japan, he would say pretty much the same thing. Why are we in South Korea? Why are we in Japan? What's the purpose of this? And by the way, they need to pay us more for the basing costs. So I went through this just before I quit. With both South Korea and Japan on Trump's desire to increase the support payments. They're called different things in different countries, but for the U.S. bases there. And he would say things like, well, we commit to defend them. They don't commit to defend us. And so you try to explain, well, the reason we commit to defend them is they've agreed to have us there in military bases, and that's what we get. Now, could we restructure the alliance treaties to reflect more mutuality there? And, I said, do you want Japanese bases in the United States? And he didn't sort of respond to that. But it's there's going to be, I think, almost inevitably, he's going to raise questions about pretty much all of our defense alliances, bilateral and more broadly. Hopefully, advisors in his second term will be more successful than some were in the first term to back him off of this. But I don't know what that answer is going to be. I really don't. Trump's been through 4 years. He's got views now that he didn't have in his first 4 years because he hadn't had any experience doing this sort of thing before. So it's something I think for the government of South Korea to pay particular attention to. I think He and President Yoon have probably spoken by now. If they haven't, certainly I hope that call gets made, and I think President Yoon ought to consider an early visit to Washington. I've offered friends in South Korea and others my observation that probably the foreign leader who affected Trump the best in the first term was Shinzo Abe of Japan, who put an enormous amount of effort into speaking with Trump on the phone, meeting with him in Washington, in Tokyo, other opportunities, G7, G20, played golf with him. I don't know if President Yoon plays golf, but it's worth a try. It takes more effort than it's probably fair or expected of a leader of a country like South Korea. All I can say is Abe did it over and over again, and I think it paid dividends. And since his views of the threats that Japan faced happened to be the same as mine as the threats that the U.S. faced, I was happy he did it. I think that's true with South Korea as well. So it's just going to take a lot of effort. It may not pay off. I mean, I think we've got to be realistic, but I think it's worth a try.
Thank you. CJ Jung, go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Thank you, Ambassador. My name is Hee-jae Jung. I'm a student at Azusa Pacific University studying international relations. I'm honored to ask you a question. My question is, how effective are economic sanctions in achieving nuclear deterrence? For instance, critics argue that President Trump's maximum pressure campaign against Iran failed to halt its nuclear program. Do sanctions typically succeed in curbing such activities, or are there more effective alternatives? Thank you.
Well, it's an important question because sanctions are, I think, one of the best tools we have, but sanctions have a very mixed record in terms of actual results. And I think what it boils down to is sanctions that are vigorously enforced tend to be more successful than those that aren't. You know, when somebody's targeted, the victim of the target of the sanctions doesn't sit around and say how terrible things are that we're being sanctioned. They find ways to evade them or mitigate them and make them ineffective. And my conclusion after 35 years plus, starting with Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, my conclusion is our sanctions enforcement mechanism in the U.S. is not very effective. And we've got the best one in the world. So if our sanctions are ineffective, everybody else's are even less so. You need a much more vigorous approach and not take a kind of lawyerly, laid-back, case-by-case approach. The most effective sanctions we had, in my experience, were the UN sanctions against Saddam Hussein because we were enforcing them with U.S. Navy and allied forces. It was very vigorous and it had a significant impact. But because Iraq's economy was sufficiently undeveloped that there wasn't a lot to do other than sanction the oil, and they found ways to ship it out through Turkey, through Jordan, through other places. That ultimately they never would have withdrawn from Kuwait, which was the objective of the sanctions. But in other cases where it's a long-term effort against whether it's the Iranian nuclear program or others, if you really tightened them and kept them tight, it might, in Iran's case, produce regime change. We had production of and sale of Iranian oil at one point down to about 100 to 200,000 barrels a day. Now it's back up to pre-sanctions levels because the administration hasn't enforced it. But if you really focus on enforcement, then it will require significant changes in U.S. government structures and capabilities. Yeah, I would use sanctions. It beats open warfare and at least demonstrates to people we've done everything we can to persuade regime X not to engage in the conduct we're objecting to. And if the sanctions aren't enough, then you have to consider what the next step will be.
Thank you. Tong, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Sanju. The question is, do you think the pursuing the denuclearization of North Korea is still possible? And if it is, of course, North Korea has rejected the idea of they're not going to write another love letter or change its course of nuclearization or strengthening of nuclear capabilities. They will keep going doing that. And what should the Trump administration, new second Trump administration should do approaching those Koreans? Like,
Well, I'm not prepared to accept North Korea as a nuclear weapon state. So to me, pursuing denuclearization remains critical. And I'd use North Korea as an example of a place where we didn't enforce sanctions effectively. We were not aggressive in doing it, including in the Trump administration. And it's no guarantee they'll succeed, but we haven't tried as hard as we can. So that would be my recommendation. Whether the new administration does it or not is your guess is as good as mine. But that's what I would say, at least for some period, to see if we can really make the sanctions bite, which they didn't bite enough in prior efforts.
Well, thank you. General Scott Perosi, go ahead.
Thank you, Sung Jo. Ambassador, it's good to see you, and thank you for taking your time to do this today. I have two quick questions. One with respect to South Korea and their desire for a nuclear weapon. I was in Seoul 3 weeks ago, and for the first time in years, two of their retired officials, not one serving, brought up to me separately, would the United States reconsider their processing of nuclear fuels in order to allow them to come closer to a breakout capability as a hedge? I hadn't heard that in a long time, and I wondered what you thought about that. And then secondly, with respect to China and Iran, China and Iran have a strategic pact that's militarily oriented. It allows China to use their ports and airports, et cetera, in exchange of equipment. What do you think the limits are in China? I think there's certainly some given Iran support for the proxy forces, instability in the Middle East, et cetera. And do you think there's a diplomatic approach there that might be helpful? And again, thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think on the latter point, if we allow this relationship with Iran to grow closer, and it's certainly true with respect to the Russians too. I mean, China's an oil importing country. Iran and Russia are both oil exporting countries, but they'd love to have Iran become part of this, really a much stronger part of the axis. And I think that's why strengthening the enforcement of the sanctions against Iran is a way to help break that. Chinese have also committed pretty substantial amounts of money to Iran's oil infrastructure, which has degraded over the years very substantially. And they're building a facility in Pakistan so they can lift oil from the Gulf, from all the Gulf countries, but particularly Iran, offload it in Pakistan and then pipe it into China, not have to carry it across the Indian Ocean and through the South China Sea. So I would return to trying to break that connection any way we can. I mean, I ultimately think you're not going to get peace and stability in the Middle East until there's a new regime in Tehran. I think they are the principal threat. I think, as you say, they're carrying on proxy war through these terrorist groups now against Israel, but they could turn them against any of the oil-producing Gulf monarchies as well. I think whether we allow reprocessing of spent fuel in South Korea as a kind of way step, that's a foot on the slippery slope toward a nuclear capacity very clearly. Normally, when we license American nuclear technology for reactors, we say no reprocessing, no uranium enrichment, no reprocessing. So I think that to me, that's another sign of how serious many people in South Korea are about getting an independent capability. And I'm certainly prepared to talk about it. I'm against it. I mean, I'm clear on that. But I understand why in South Korea people are worried about the dependability of the American nuclear umbrella. So we need to face this, and we need to have an American decision that we're serious about it, that other countries believe. Otherwise, the extended deterrent fails. That seems pretty clear to me.
Thank you. Bayer, go ahead.
Maybe we can make this our last question, if that's okay.
Okay, it's the last question. Bayer, go ahead, quick.
Okay, I have a couple of questions. First of all, let me just comment that I don't quite agree with your comment saying that North Korea is nuclear threat to United States, because first of all, there is no benefits out of striking U.S. with the nuclear weapons. from the North Korea's perspective, because that's almost suicidal for Kim Jong-un and or any of his successors, because it's rather beneficial for the North Korean leadership to survive and continue its regime than to initiate a war, nuclear war against the U.S. and be, completely destroyed, annihilated. So I don't think that's. I don't quite agree with your comment saying that the North Korea has a nuclear threat to U.S. In some sense, it is. It's understandable that they have the capability to strike the U.S. With nuclear weapons, but understanding the human psychology, it's definitely suicidal, and I don't think they will make that illogical decision to destroy themselves. So in light of that, putting that aside, I guess my question is, unfortunately, with the sanctions in force in the past 20 years or even longer, it did not succeed. I think the U.S. has significantly underestimated the North Korea's determination to obtain the nuclear weapons as a security blanket. And with their closer ties built up with Russia through the Mutual Defense Treaty, the leverage that the U.S. can offer in resolving the North Korea's issue has diminished significantly.
So, Pierre, what's your question, please?
Yeah. So, what is the best strategy to approach the North Korea's issue in the long term? The second question is, how do you, with the Ukraine war, coming to end probably with the incoming Trump's administration, if it ends up as the Trump suggested, that Russia taking 20% of the Ukraine's land, I think it's opened up a big Pandora's box to not only to the rogue states like China and Russia, but also to many of the U.S. ally countries, saying that basically U.S. is not going to be trustworthy to rely on the U.S.'s.
Okay, Pierre, please put your question, please.
Yeah, so I think it's going to open a huge gate. So, could you comment on that?
Yeah. Well, look, I think on Ukraine, I think the Trump approach is going to be very bad for the United States worldwide. I think in Beijing, they're going to say, look, if the United States isn't willing to act against unprovoked aggression on the continent of Europe, who really thinks they're going to care about Taiwan? I mean, I think it's going to leave us in a difficult position. I just say in terms of the sanctions that we've applied against North Korea, which you say have been ineffective for 20 years, that finished, as I said in the earlier response on sanctions, I just don't think we've enforced them as effectively as we could. I don't think the sanctions were strong enough. And in terms of the North Korean nuclear threat against the United States, a threat against one American city with the right president could have a significant impact. And it's not just against the continental United States. It's about our deployed forces in the Pacific, for example, in Guam. That are quite vulnerable to the North Koreans. And I just say one final word that I probably should have mentioned earlier. I think you've got to take all this in the context of the Chinese nuclear buildup, which the latest estimates, which I think are very understated, is the Chinese will have 1,000 strategic deliverable warheads by 2030. I think it'll be before that and at a higher number. So as China comes close to being a peer with Russia and the United States, we're in a world we don't know anything about. Because during the Cold War, everything we did in terms of nuclear strategy was based on a bipolar nuclear world. All of our weapons calculations, all of our deterrence theory, all of our arms control negotiations. We're in a bipolar nuclear world. And all these geniuses like Albert Wohlstetter and Herman Kahn and Thomas Schelling and on and on and on thought in bipolar terms. In a tripolar nuclear world, those calculations don't mean anything because it's three people playing chess instead of two. And that's the kind of circumstance that rogue states like North Korea and Iran can really increase their leverage, because to the extent they're operating like free electrons, that's a threat that makes what was complicated in a bipolar nuclear world, even worse in a tripolar world. And I'm afraid Kim Jong-un gets that point, and that really worries me.
Well, thank you, John. I appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, time is up. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ambassador Brown. We'll get back to you, John.
Okay, thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.